In the American consciousness, certain surnames do not merely identify a family, they act as towering monuments. They are woven into the very fabric of the nation, representing an era of unimaginable ambition, ruthless industry, and gilded excess. At the absolute pinnacle of this American aristocracy sits the Vanderbilt dynasty. But history has a cruel way of demonstrating that while massive fortunes can construct palaces of marble and gold, they are entirely incapable of protecting the fragile human mind from its own darkness. This is not just a historical account of lost wealth. It is a psychological autopsy of privilege, unbearable pressure, and a brilliant young man who was crushed beneath the weight of a legendary legacy. To comprehend the profound tragedy of Carter Vanderbilt Cooper, one must first measure the sheer, suffocating gravity of the crown he inherited. The Vanderbilt Empire was forged in the relentless fires of the 19th century by his great-great-great-grandfather, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Known simply and fearfully as the Commodore, Cornelius did not inherit his throne. He clawed his way up from the absolute bottom. Born into poverty on Staten Island in the late 1700s, he began his life operating a tiny, rugged ferry boat. But beneath his humble beginnings lay a terrifyingly ruthless business, intellect, and a vision that would fundamentally alter the geography of the United States. Cornelius methodically built a staggering monopoly, first dominating the waterways along the eastern seaboard and the Caribbean, and then ruthlessly consolidating the fractured railroad networks. He laid the steel arteries that connected New York to the rest of the expanding continent. By the time he died in 1877, he possessed a fortune so colossal it defied contemporary understanding, equivalent to hundreds of billions in modern currency. His descendants did not just inherit money, they inherited an imperative to display it. The succeeding generations of Vanderbilts transformed their industrial wealth into monumental declarations of social supremacy. They constructed the Breakers in Newport, an awe-inspiring 70-room palace echoing the Italian Renaissance. They built the Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, an architectural leviathan featuring 250 rooms, making it the largest private residence ever constructed in the country. These estates were not homes. They were fortresses of status, designed to announce to the world that the Vanderbilts were the undisputed monarchs of high society. They married European nobility, hoarded global art masterpieces, and dictated the rules of the transatlantic elite. However, by the time Carter Vanderbilt Cooper was born in the bitter January of 1965, the physical empire had fractured. Generations of lavish spending, sprawling estates, and financial mismanagement had severely diluted the actual wealth. Yet, the psychological burden of the name remained entirely intact. The money had faded, but the suffocating expectation to be exceptional, to live up to the ghosts of the Gilded Age, still haunted the bloodline. Carter's mother was Gloria Vanderbilt, a woman whose own life had been profoundly damaged by the family name. Long before she became an iconic fashion designer and artist, Gloria was known to the world as the poor little rich girl. Her childhood was a highly publicized, deeply traumatizing spectacle. At the age of 10, she was the center of a vicious, tabloid-fueled custody battle, dragged through the courts and raised in an emotional vacuum devoid of genuine parental warmth. She survived her youth by being shuttled between cold relatives and rigid boarding schools, eventually enduring a series of disastrous marriages. Then, she met Wyatt Cooper. Wyatt was the exact antithesis of the Vanderbilt machinery. Raised in modest circumstances in Quitman, Mississippi, Wyatt Emery Cooper possessed a wealth that the Vanderbilts could never purchase: profound emotional intelligence. He was a gifted writer and screenwriter, a man defined by a deep, resonant kindness and a gentle intellect. When Wyatt married the traumatized heiress, he did not just offer her a ring. He offered her a sanctuary. For the very first time in her life, Gloria experienced authentic stability and uncalculated love. Wyatt was fiercely determined to break the generational curse. He swore that their children would never experience the cold, transactional childhood that had scarred their mother. Together, they welcomed Carter, and 2 years later, his younger brother, Anderson. Inside their elegant Manhattan penthouse, Wyatt constructed a universe entirely distinct from the rigid expectations of high society. The home was heavily adorned with Gloria's vibrant artwork and thousands of books, but more importantly, it was saturated with warmth. Wyatt rejected the distant, hands-off parenting style typical of the ultra-wealthy elite. He was intensely, beautifully present. He read to his sons for hours, immersing them in history and literature. At the dinner table, he engaged them in complex conversations about politics and culture, treating his young boys as intelligent, autonomous individuals worthy of profound respect. Under this remarkable nurturing, Carter blossomed into a boy of extraordinary depth. Even as a child attending the prestigious Dalton School, his brilliance was obvious. But it was a quiet, introspective brilliance. He was not interested in competing for social dominance. He was deeply fascinated by the architecture of human societies and the flow of history. Friends remember a boy with striking hazel eyes who possessed a preternatural ability to listen. He absorbed the world around him with intense empathy, inheriting his mother's artistic sensitivity and his father's profound emotional radar. He was a child who felt the world deeply, perhaps too deeply. This beautiful, carefully constructed sanctuary was a miracle. But in January 1978, the miracle was violently shattered. Wyatt Cooper, the emotional anchor of the family, began experiencing heart complications. At just 50 years old, he entered a New York hospital for what was supposed to be a manageable open-heart surgery. But devastating complications arose in the operating room. Wyatt suffered a catastrophic heart attack on the surgical table and never woke up. In a single, unimaginable instant, the sun vanished from the Cooper household. Gloria was plunged into a paralyzing grief, losing the only man who had ever made her feel entirely safe. But for Carter, who was merely 13 years old, the loss was an earthquake that destroyed his foundation. The man who had shielded him from the immense pressures of the world, the father who had taught him how to navigate his own deep sensitivity, was permanently gone. The sanctuary had collapsed, leaving a brilliant, deeply feeling boy standing in the ruins, forced to carry the weight of the Vanderbilt legacy entirely alone. When a catastrophic loss strikes a family, the immediate aftermath is rarely characterized by loud, cinematic breakdowns. More often, it is defined by a suffocating, unbearable silence. Following the sudden death of Wyatt Cooper in 1978, the vibrant Manhattan penthouse that had once echoed with intellectual debates and warm laughter was transformed into a mausoleum of memories. Every antique chair, every book left open on a desk, and every piece of art became an agonizing reminder of the man who was no longer there. The surviving members of the Cooper family were forced to navigate this wreckage, but the blast radius of the trauma affected each of them in profoundly different ways. Gloria Vanderbilt, a woman who had spent her entire life running from the emotional abandonment of her own childhood, was utterly devastated. The single pillar of unconditional love in her universe had collapsed, plunging her into a paralyzing oceanic grief. Anderson, who was only 10 years old at the time, reacted with the raw instinct of a survivor. He later admitted that his father's death fundamentally rewired his personality. The outgoing, carefree boy vanished overnight, replaced by a highly introverted, hypervigilant child. Anderson began building towering emotional walls, analyzing the world through a lens of potential threat and impermanence, subconsciously preparing himself for the next inevitable disaster. But the psychological burden placed upon Carter, who was 13, was infinitely more complex and dangerous. 13 is a incredibly precarious age. You are old enough to fully comprehend the absolute, terrifying finality of death, yet far too young to possess the emotional tools required to process it. As the eldest son, Carter watched his mother shatter and his younger brother withdraw. In the gaping vacuum left by his father, Carter seemed to absorb an unspoken, crushing responsibility. He became the designated anchor. While Anderson retreated inward, Carter stepped forward, attempting to project strength and stability for a family unit that was bleeding out. The tragedy of this dynamic is profound. When a 13-year-old boy instinctively suppresses his own trauma to act as the emotional caretaker for his grieving mother, his personal pain does not simply evaporate. It is buried alive, and in the dark, untreated and unspoken, that grief slowly begins to metastasize. On the surface, however, Carter Cooper appeared to be executing a masterclass in resilience. As he navigated his teenage years and transitioned into early adulthood, he evolved into the absolute zenith of the American aristocratic ideal. In 1983, he walked through the historic gates of Princeton University. Attending an Ivy League institution was the expected trajectory for a descendant of the Vanderbilt dynasty, but Carter refused to simply coast on the immense privilege of his last name. At Princeton, he did not blend into the stereotypes of entitled, arrogant heirs. Instead, he distinguished himself through a quiet, staggering brilliance. He chose to major in history, a poetic and perhaps melancholic choice for a young man whose own family history was a heavy, inescapable shadow. His professors marveled at his capacity for sophisticated, original analysis. He was fascinated by the intricate ways societies evolved, how monumental empires rose and inevitably fell, and how historical forces shaped the human condition. More remarkable than his academic prowess was his extraordinary character. In the fiercely competitive, ego-driven ecosystem of an Ivy League campus, Carter was universally beloved for his radical humility. Friends and classmates consistently described him using the same rare trait. He was an exceptional listener. He possessed a unique, magnetic ability to make the person standing in front of him feel entirely heard and deeply valued. He asked questions not to showcase his own formidable intellect, but out of a genuine, pure curiosity about the internal lives of others. He absorbed the stories and perspectives of his peers with boundless empathy. Perhaps, for a young man carrying an unspoken reservoir of internal pain, listening to the struggles of others was a way to momentarily escape the deafening silence in his own mind. He graduated from Princeton with honors in 1987, a picture-perfect young intellectual ready to inherit the world. Carter carried his father's emotional warmth, his mother's striking elegance, and a resume that promised limitless potential. He immediately channeled his passion for history and literature into a promising career in publishing. He secured a highly coveted editorial position at American Heritage magazine in New York, and later contributed to The Public Interest, a prestigious journal in Washington focusing on complex social policy. He was not just working a job, he was actively shaping the intellectual conversations of his era. His colleagues admired his dedication, his razor-sharp editing skills, and his unfailing kindness. By the summer of 1988, Carter Vanderbilt Cooper was 23 years old. If you looked at his life on paper, or observed him walking down Madison Avenue, you would see absolute perfection. He was handsome, independently successful, deeply loved by his mother and brother, well respected by his peers, and financially secure for the rest of his life. He was the golden boy who had survived a childhood tragedy and emerged completely victorious. What could possibly go wrong? This is the most terrifying, insidious truth about severe clinical depression. Society is deeply conditioned to view depression through the lens of circumstance. We assume that if someone possesses wealth, a loving family, a brilliant mind, and a flawless resume, they are biologically immune to despair. We believe that logic and privilege act as impenetrable shields against mental illness. But depression is utterly blind to your pedigree. It does not respect an Ivy League diploma. It does not care about the balance of a trust fund. And it certainly does not care how fiercely your mother loves you. It is a ruthless disease that actively distorts reality, turning a life of limitless privilege into an inescapable, suffocating, dark room. Nobody, not his colleagues, not his friends, and not even his devoted mother, could see the invisible structural collapse happening within his mind. The brilliant, empathetic young man who spent his life expertly listening to everyone else was quietly fighting a screaming battle inside his own head, and he was losing. The foundation that had initially cracked in a hospital waiting room 10 years prior was finally, catastrophically giving way. The summer of 1988 was approaching, and the flawless facade was about to shatter in the most horrific way imaginable. The human mind possesses a terrifying capacity to conceal its own destruction. By the time the summer of 1988 arrived, the silent war raging inside Carter Vanderbilt Cooper was beginning to breach the surface, though in ways so subtle they were almost impossible to decipher for those around him. He had recently begun seeing a therapist, a quiet admission that the flawless Princeton graduate was struggling to hold his universe together. There was also a new prescription, an asthma medication called salbutamol. In the agonizing decades that followed, his mother, Gloria, would fiercely cling to this medication as the definitive catalyst for the tragedy. She theorized that the drug had triggered a sudden, severe psychotic episode. This was not mere denial, it was the desperate psychological survival mechanism of a grieving parent. When faced with the unbearable reality of a child choosing death, the human brain demands a tangible villain, a chemical imbalance, a bad reaction to a pill, an external anomaly. These are physical explanations that offer a fragile shield against the terrifying abyss of the inexplicable. But the brutal truth of severe mental illness is that it rarely provides clean answers. The darkness does not require a chemical trigger to consume its host. July 22nd started as a profoundly ordinary Friday morning inside the Upper East Side penthouse. The apartment, situated high on the 14th floor, offered sweeping, cinematic views of the Manhattan skyline. This was not just premium real estate. This was the physical epicenter of Carter's childhood. This was the space where his father had read to him, where the walls were saturated with memories of intellectual debates and unconditional love. It was the absolute safest place in his world. Anderson was away, carving out the beginnings of his own independent life. The sprawling apartment was quiet, occupied only by the mother and her golden son. According to the harrowing accounts Gloria would later force herself to share with the world, the nightmare began with a subtle, disorienting shift in reality. Carter had been sleeping. When he emerged into the living space, something was deeply, fundamentally wrong. He appeared profoundly dazed, his consciousness seemingly detached from the physical room. He was not the sharp, articulate editor his colleagues knew, nor the warm, empathetic son Gloria adored. He was locked in a state of severe disorientation, navigating a terrifying internal landscape that nobody else could see. And then, without a single word of explanation, he moved toward the terrace. The terrace was a defining feature of the penthouse, separated from a sheer drop to the Manhattan pavement by a low perimeter wall. When Carter stepped out into the summer air, Gloria followed. The mild concern she felt moments prior instantly mutated into pure, paralyzing terror. Carter climbed up onto the ledge. He sat on the low wall, suspended 13 floors above the unforgiving concrete of the city. He positioned himself with one foot resting on the safety of the terrace and the other leg dangling over the infinite void. He stared downward, his gaze locked on the street far below, entirely unresponsive to the reality behind him. What followed was a standoff that defies the absolute limits of human agony. Gloria Vanderbilt, the fashion icon, the heiress who had survived a century of family trauma, was reduced to a mother begging for the life of her child. She screamed his name. She pleaded with a wild, primal desperation. "Carter, come back! Carter, come back!" She repeated the phrase over and over like a desperate incantation, praying that the sheer force of her love could act as a tether to pull him back from the edge. Time, in moments of catastrophic trauma, ceases to function normally. Seconds stretch into agonizing hours. For one fragile, suspended moment, the frantic screaming seemed to pierce the fog of his detachment. Gloria believed, with every fibre of her being, that he was going to listen. She saw a flicker of hesitation, a shift in his posture that suggested he was about to swing his leg back over the wall, step down onto the solid ground, and end the nightmare. In that fleeting second, salvation felt entirely possible. She believed the day was going to end with tears and an emergency hospital visit, but her son was going to live. But the mind in crisis operates by its own devastating logic. The hesitation vanished. Carter moved. Gloria would later describe his final motion as fluid and deliberate, like an athlete. He shifted his weight, hanging over the edge of the wall, suspended only by his grip. The mother's screams echoed against the brick and glass of the Manhattan skyline, a soundtrack of absolute despair. And then, he simply let go. Carter Vanderbilt Cooper fell 14 stories. Gloria stood frozen on the terrace, forced to watch the most horrific sequence a human being can witness. The brilliant young man with the hazel eyes, the empathetic soul who spent his life listening to others, the son she called her perfect child, disappeared from her world in a matter of seconds. The transition was absolute and irreversible. In the deafening, static shock that instantly follows such a trauma, an overwhelming instinct gripped Gloria. As she stared over the ledge at the space where her son had been mere seconds before, an intense, magnetic pull urged her to follow him. The pain was so immediate, so completely unendurable, that throwing herself off the same wall seemed like the only logical action. She wanted to erase the reality that had just been birthed. But as her mind hovered on the precipice of that final choice, an image flashed through her shattered consciousness. Anderson. If she stepped over that wall, her younger son, barely 21 years old, would be left entirely alone on the earth. He had already lost his father at the age of 10. He was currently losing his brother. If she jumped, Anderson's entire immediate family would be wiped out before his life had even truly begun. The sheer weight of Anderson's future was the only force strong enough to counter the gravity of her grief. She stepped back from the ledge. She chose to survive, condemning herself to a lifetime of unanswerable questions. Within minutes, the wailing sirens of emergency services shattered the morning. Police officers flooded the sanctuary. The investigation was brutally swift and entirely conclusive. There was no suicide note left on a desk. The subsequent toxicology reports confirmed there were no illegal drugs or alcohol in his system. The authorities ruled it a definitive act of suicide. A young man, in the grip of an unseen crisis, had made a permanent decision in a fraction of a second. At 23 years old, the life of Carter Vanderbilt Cooper was extinguished, leaving behind a crater of grief that would permanently alter the trajectory of everyone who survived him. The immediate shockwave of a violent tragedy is devastating, but it is the long, agonizing silence of the aftermath that truly breaks the human spirit. When the news of the 14th floor nightmare finally reached Anderson Cooper, he was 21 years old. He was not present in the penthouse. He did not witness the frantic standoff on the terrace, nor did he hear his mother's desperate screams fracturing the Manhattan morning. He was spared the visual horror, but the psychological impact struck him with a force that permanently severed his life into two distinct eras: before Carter and after Carter. In the decades that would follow his brother's death, Anderson would openly confess a chilling reality. The memory of the suicide does not merely visit him occasionally. It is a permanent resident in his mind, a heavy, suffocating weight that he carries through every single day of his existence. For Gloria Vanderbilt, surviving her son meant entering a meticulously constructed psychological purgatory. The glamorous fashion icon, the heiress who had seemingly conquered her own tragic childhood, was reduced to a shattered shell of a human being. In the days following the funeral, she remained imprisoned in her bed, consumed by an ocean of tears that offered absolutely no relief. When Carter's friends came to the apartment to offer their hollow condolences, they were met by a mother whose eyes burned with a terrifying, wild desperation. She interrogated them endlessly, frantically searching their memories for any hidden clue, any microscopic warning sign, or any stray conversation that could possibly explain the inexplicable. But the young men had no answers to give. They were just as blind to the darkness as she had been. Left with nothing but a devastating void, Gloria's traumatized mind began to loop like a broken film reel. She recounted the final minutes on the terrace incessantly to anyone who would listen, and even to the empty room when she was alone. She analyzed every millisecond of that morning, constructing an endless, torturous labyrinth of hypothetical scenarios. What if she had moved closer to the ledge? Would her sudden movement have startled him into losing his grip? Or could she have successfully grabbed his arm and pulled him to safety? What if she had used different words? What if she had woken up earlier? The relentless barrage of these questions became her only tether to sanity. She later wrote in her poignant memoirs that the agony was so absolute, she actively wanted to die in the aftermath. The agonizing, repetitive recitation of the story was the only mechanism keeping her heart beating. The trauma also acted as an executioner for the family's joy. The first winter after the tragedy, the concept of celebration felt utterly grotesque. Instead of engaging in holiday traditions, Gloria and Anderson sought refuge in the dark anonymity of a movie theater, followed by a silent meal at a sterile automat. From that terrible winter onward, the holiday season was permanently stained by grief, effectively erased from the calendar of their lives. Anderson stood by as the primary witness to his mother's complete unraveling. For days on end, the 21-year-old lay beside her in the darkened bedroom, holding her fragile frame and absorbing the relentless, toxic recounting of his brother's final seconds. But human empathy, even for a fiercely beloved mother, has a breaking point. Eventually, the sheer weight of her repetitive trauma became too massive for the young man to bear. He reached a point where he physically and emotionally could no longer listen to the story of the fall. He had to construct a barricade to protect his own fracturing mind. He needed to find a way to navigate a grief that was deeply compounded by a terrifying, intensely personal fear. In the wake of Carter's suicide, Anderson was suddenly haunted by the terrifying spectre of genetics. He stared into the pitch-black abyss of his family history and wondered, with paralyzing dread, if the exact same fatal darkness was quietly lying dormant inside his own mind. Was severe depression a ticking time bomb hidden in his DNA? If his brilliant, kind, and seemingly perfect older brother could be consumed so utterly by despair, what was protecting him? This profound fear of an inherited doom forced the young man to question his own fundamental capacity to survive. To combat this existential dread, Anderson made a radical, seemingly illogical pivot in his life trajectory. As a descendant of the legendary Vanderbilt dynasty, holding a degree from Yale University, he possessed the ultimate golden ticket. He could have effortlessly glided into a comfortable, highly lucrative executive position at any major television network, media conglomerate, or publishing house in New York City. He could have chosen a life of absolute safety and immense privilege. Instead, he actively sought out the most dangerous, unstable environments on the face of the planet. Driven by a restless agony, Anderson forged a press pass, grabbed a handheld camera, and deliberately smuggled himself into the war-torn jungles of Burma. Shortly after, he plunged headfirst into the famine-ravaged, lawless deserts of Somalia. He entirely bypassed the safety nets of elite society and threw himself into active, brutal combat zones where Western journalists rarely dared to venture. To the outside observer, this looked like the reckless ambition of a young, adrenaline-fueled reporter trying to make a name for himself. But the reality was deeply rooted in the psychology of profound loss. After witnessing the sudden, inexplicable evaporation of his brother's life, the trivialities of polite Manhattan dinner party conversations felt entirely absurd and utterly unbearable. He could not stomach listening to wealthy elites complain about minor inconveniences when he had just experienced the absolute fragility of human existence. Anderson desperately craved environments where the struggle for survival was not an abstract psychological concept, but a raw, immediate, and physical reality. In Somalia, surrounded by the horrific specter of mass starvation and the absolute collapse of civil society, he found a bizarre, grounding sense of clarity. His early foray into foreign reporting was not initially about building a pristine journalism career. It was a desperate, extreme form of psychological self-medication. He was throwing himself directly into the crucible of war to test his own structural integrity. Every dangerous assignment, every close call with a bullet, and every encounter with starvation was a challenge to his own psyche. It was a rigorous, terrifying way of proving to himself that he could endure extreme, life-threatening adversity without breaking. He needed to prove, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that he was tougher than the invisible darkness that had claimed his brother. In the fires of global conflict, the younger Cooper brother was desperately forging the heavy armor he needed to survive the rest of his life. The physical remains of Carter Vanderbilt Cooper were laid to rest in the sprawling, historic Vanderbilt family cemetery located in New Dorp, Staten Island. He was buried alongside generations of American titans, taking his place in the long, storied history of one of the nation's most powerful dynasties. When Gloria Vanderbilt eventually passed away in the summer of 2019, at the age of 95, and decades after Wyatt Cooper's death, the family that had endured such devastating, unimaginable losses was finally reunited in the earth. But a tombstone in a historic cemetery cannot capture the true weight of a human life, especially one extinguished so prematurely. How do we accurately measure the legacy of a brilliant young man whose narrative was violently interrupted at merely 23 years old? His friends and colleagues remember a soul defined by profound intelligence and exceptional kindness. They recall his deep passion for historical narratives, his striking Princeton intellect, and his quiet, gentle presence in a publishing world dominated by loud egos. These achievements were supposed to be merely the prologue of a remarkable, expansive life. He was on the trajectory to become a prominent historian, a respected author, or a powerful voice in American intellectual discourse. We will never truly know the magnitude of what he might have accomplished, because the dark gravity of depression pulled him under before he could fully spread his wings. The tragedy becomes exponentially more agonizing when you consider the sheer volume of life that Carter missed. He never witnessed his younger brother evolve into one of the most respected, courageous journalists in modern American history. He never saw Anderson reporting live from the devastating wreckage of Hurricane Katrina or standing in the dust of international war zones. He never had the opportunity to hold Anderson's sons, one of whom was named Wyatt, in honor of the father they both lost so early. He never experienced the profound joy of falling deeply in love, building his own family, or writing the books he was destined to write. 23 years is barely the dawn of adulthood. It is the very beginning of the journey, and then, in a terrifying instant, the book was permanently closed. However, the true legacy of Carter Cooper is perhaps most visible in the profound transformation of the people who survived him. Gloria Vanderbilt spent the remainder of her long life carrying a grief that defied human comprehension. But instead of letting that grief entirely destroy her, she eventually chose to weaponize it for good. She poured her agonizing experience into her memoirs, stripping away the glamorous facade of high society to reveal the raw, unvarnished agony of a mother who had lost a child to suicide. She wrote with the desperate hope that her terrifying honesty could act as a lifeline for other parents drowning in similar tragedies. She wanted to assure them that while the wound never truly heals, it is miraculously possible to survive the absolute worst nightmare imaginable. Anderson Cooper's entire professional architecture was fundamentally shaped by the questions of loss, survival, and human resilience that his brother's death forced him to confront. He deliberately built a career, standing shoulder to shoulder, with people facing profound, unimaginable suffering. More recently, Anderson has actively worked to dismantle the toxic stigma surrounding mental health and grief. He launched a deeply personal podcast titled All There Is, a platform dedicated entirely to exploring the complex landscapes of profound loss. He interviews other public figures who have navigated devastating tragedies, creating a public space for conversations that are usually hidden in the shadows. The entire inspiration for this project stems directly from the losses that defined his youth: his father at 10, his brother at 21, and eventually his mother. It is Anderson's powerful method of transmuting his family's darkest hours into a beacon of empathy, helping millions of listeners feel less isolated in their own private grief. The story of Carter Vanderbilt Cooper serves as a chilling, definitive reminder that severe mental illness is a truly blind predator. It absolutely does not care about the prominence of your last name, the prestige of your university degree, or how impossibly perfect your life appears from the outside. Depression does not discriminate between a struggling worker and an American aristocrat. It is a biological and psychological disease that requires intense compassion, open dialogue, and immediate treatment. The tragic reality is that Carter's death occurred in an era when mental health crises were heavily stigmatized, shrouded in silence, and often treated with a devastating lack of understanding. And if the retelling of his story can encourage just one struggling individual to reach out for professional help, or if it prompts one family to have an honest, uncomfortable conversation about depression before it is too late, then perhaps his heartbreakingly short life can contribute a massive, life-saving value to the world he left far too soon. The Vanderbilt name carries an almost mythological weight in American culture. It is synonymous with limitless wealth, architectural grandeur, and the heavy expectations of history. But all the billions of dollars, all the sprawling mansions, and all the immense social power of that legendary dynasty were completely powerless to protect Carter from the invisible darkness that claimed him on that July morning in 1988. The fortune could not save him, and the legacy cannot bring him back. But what we can do is ensure that he is remembered accurately. He was not merely a tragic headline or a footnote in the history of a wealthy family. He was a brilliant, profoundly empathetic young man who loved history, cherished his family, and carried a pain too heavy for his soul to bear. He was someone's beloved son, someone's fiercely missed brother, and a light that went out far too early in a world that desperately needed his quiet kindness.